Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. All right, welcome to the show, everybody. I am very excited today because I have probably the darling of the biohacking community right now on the show, Dr. Casey Means, MD, who is the Chief Medical Officer and co-founder of the metabolic health company Levels. She also is the associate editor of the International Journal of Disease Reversal and Prevention, and she has held research positions at the NIH, Stanford School of Medicine, and NYU, and blah, blah, blah. She's absolutely an amazing doctor and doing amazing things in our community right now. I'm incredibly honored to have you, Dr. Casey Means. Thank you so much for being on the Next Level Human podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm just thrilled to have this conversation.
I am too. I mean, it's really interesting what you have done for our community. Now, of course, continuous glucose monitoring, CGM, has been around a little bit. But for those you don't know, Dr. Casey Means has been one of the people who's bringing this to the public in a very big way. And so if you haven't heard of Levels Health and you haven't heard of Dr. Casey Means, you're kind of going to be hearing a lot about Levels and a lot about her in the future. And I'm sure those of you who are in the biohacking community and you doctors and physicians who listen to this show, if you do not know her and you do not know about Levels, you're going to want to make sure you check her out. So let's just get into this really quick. Dr. Means, tell me, and for us, what is so exciting about continuous glucose monitoring? What is it? How did you get into it? I just want you to kind of start wherever you want to start with this story.
Yeah, well, I love the way that you asked that question. What is so exciting about this? Because I really do think it is potentially exciting for everyone. And the reason for that is because nutrition has been a black box forever. We sort of put stuff in and we don't get really any feedback on it. And we're trying to, we eat like a metric ton of food per year. We're eating pounds of food per day, and we're kind of doing it flying blind. And continuous glucose monitoring can really help cut through some of that mystery. So this is a wearable device that you put on your arm, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's giving you biofeedback. It's like a tiny little lab test on your arm continuously that's telling you how you're responding to food with this really important biologic readout, which is glucose. Glucose is the fundamental unit of metabolism. It's the fundamental substrate of metabolism in the body, which means it's fundamental to how we make energy in the body, how we convert energy to food. And it changes constantly based on what we're eating, how we're living, things like stress management, exercise, sleep, how our microbiome's doing, how our micronutrient status is doing. So it's this readout of these complex variables around how we're eating and how we're living, and can give us tons of information about how we should personalize and shape our day-to-day diets and life. And so that's really exciting because the average American goes on a diet each year. Like over 50% of Americans are trying to go on a diet to lose weight each year. So what does that say to us? That people are trying, people want to do better with food. People want to optimize their diet and lifestyle for better outcomes. And so to actually now have a tool that can give us objective, real information and not just hearsay, not just maybe the number on the scale the next day, not a cholesterol test 6 months from now, but immediate. I eat this and 15 minutes later, I have some feedback about whether that was really serving my goals or whether it might not be the best choice for me. So I think that's going to give people a lot of empowerment and just sort of a handhold in what otherwise has been notoriously a very open loop system with very long feedback cycles that are sometimes really unhelpful when you're trying to determine, individual day-to-day choices.
Yeah, I love the way you explain that. And it really is kind of flying like with a blindfold up until this point. One of the things I've always sort of talked about in my clinical practice is this idea, this silly little acronym I use called SHMEC. It's SHMEC, sleep, hunger, mood, energy, cravings. And what I used to say is there are two things required for fat loss in the body. We need a calorie deficit and we need our hormones, our hunger hormones balanced so we can sustain that calorie deficit. So we need to keep SHMEC in check. The problem, though, is that SHMEC is a purely subjective evaluation. So now, along with sort of this biofeedback, we now have with this CGM device, this wearable device, an objective evaluation to go along with this that tells us exactly how food is impacting us. And what's exciting for all you listeners is one of the things I've oftentimes talked about and I'm known for is this idea that I wish for such a long time that we would do individualized nutrition rather than this cookbook, cookie cutter, one size fits all nutrition. And this to me allows us to do that. And so my next question to you, Dr. Means, is have you seen, do we have research, do we have data that you've been looking at that when a human, I eat the same food, let's say you and I both sit down and we decide we're going to have breakfast together and you have a bagel and I have a bagel. How does this differ? Is there going to be differences between me and you in terms of how we metabolize that particular bagel? Will we see that on this monitor? And can we use that data to then change our nutrition choices?
Absolutely. And that's such a great example of a bagel because this is a standardized piece of food and your bagel and my bagel are going to have the exact same amount of carbohydrates and therefore the exact same amount of sort of potential glucose that's going into the body. And what research has shown us over the past 5 years or so is that contrary to the sort of glycemic index type philosophy, which is that when you eat a certain food, like a bagel or a piece of white bread, it will cause a certain amount of glucose rise in the body. What we've learned from the research is that that's actually not the case. You and I very likely could have a totally different glucose response or glycemic response to that bagel. And that's because the bagel is interacting with this complex organism of different amounts of muscle, different level of insulin sensitivity, different microbiome, different micronutrient status, different sleep and exercise the day before or the day of the bagel. All of these things can factor into that process of converting that bagel in the mouth to glucose in the blood being different. And that has really large implications for our health because if I get a gigantic glucose spike, if my body and my physiology converts that bagel into a quick release of glucose in my bloodstream, that's going to have a different physiologic sort of cascade to you if the bagel causes a very, very little glucose rise in your blood. When we get these large glucose excursions, these big quick peaks after meals, that's not great for our body over time. Sure, in a healthy person who, is not someone dealing with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, a big glucose spike after a meal, you can release insulin and get that glucose back down to normal and process that glucose. Sure, that's fine. But when those big spikes are happening, maybe multiple times a day, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year for decades, that has significant ramifications on our bodies and our physiologies. And you don't want to do that. You want to stick with foods that have much smaller and more gentle glucose elevations to kind of keep things sensitive and on track. And that leads into sort of a broader discussion about insulin sensitivity, which I'm sure your listeners are kind of familiar with that concept. But basically those big spikes, simply put, those big spikes day after day are going to cause this insulin release to help you get it out of your bloodstream and back into the cells. And when that happens over and over and over again, repeatedly, because of foods we're eating that are spiking our glucose, the body can become numb to that insulin signal. It's seen too much insulin around and it's saying, this is taxing us too much and we're trying to force too much glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells. the cells become resistant to it. Then the body has to pump out more insulin to drive that same amount of glucose into the cell. And then you start going down this pathway of insulin resistance where insulin is rising, ultimately glucose is rising. And that's when you start getting some of the real problems with metabolic dysfunction and that path towards metabolic disease, like obesity, diabetes, et cetera. And so it is of great importance to us to understand which foods are going to keep our glucose a little bit more low and stable so that we can kind of keep these systems sharp and not be taxing our body so frequently with these big insulin surges. And it's not just the downstream insulin effects that are problematic over time. It's also just the impact of glucose in the bloodstream in its own right. High glucose in the bloodstream can cause inflammation. It can cause oxidative stress. It can cause glycation, which is the process whereby sugar just sticks to things in the body and causes problems. So you want to keep the glucose you want to keep glucose in a healthy, low, fairly stable range as much as you can throughout your lifetime to really achieve sort of the best possible outcomes in terms of current metabolic performance, but also long-term avoidance of chronic disease, longevity, et cetera.
Yeah, I love the way you describe that. And what's really interesting about this, the old thought, right, was just like, okay, well, if Dr. Means and I eat the same food, we're going to have the same risk of insulin resistance because we're eating the same kind of foods. What this new technology is sort of doing for us is saying, okay, well, there's a certain amount and type of food that I can eat versus a certain amount and type of food that you can eat to have a healthy level. And we can see this in these spikes. And then the other sort of thing that's interesting here, and I want to see where you want to take us with this, because this is a question about this idea that I have seen clinically. Oftentimes people who seem to eat perfectly, or perhaps don't eat at all, or perhaps are experimenting with things like intermittent fasting and things like this. And when you look at their blood sugar levels, you actually see that their blood sugar levels are running high. Perhaps that you're looking at them and saying, well, that's interesting. They seem to be eating, quote, healthy. They seem to be doing, quote, the right things that the books say, or that the latest guru says, or the latest podcast says, or the latest documentary says, yet their blood sugars are high, which brings us into this question of stress also, and you already alluded to this, can raise blood sugar. So one of the things we oftentimes see clinically is someone who wakes up with high fasting blood sugar levels, despite eating a very healthy, quote, healthy diet. And I'm using that in quotes because I think this new CGM technology actually tells us now what maybe we thought was healthy may not always be healthy for us. And so there's another side to this insulin food sort of insulin resistance food equation. And now we can look at, even with CGMs, this stress effect and insulin resistance as well. And you see this show up as well when someone's sort of maybe over secreting cortisol, having sleep deprivation issues, and you see blood sugars that are higher than you would think based on what they're eating. And so is there anything that you can say about that in terms of, are we able to spot stress effects with the CGM as well? Can we actually see when we're stressing out and raising blood sugar levels versus when we're eating and raising blood sugar levels?
So you bring up such a great point about the impact of things other than food on glucose. And this is really important because what I like to say that diet is necessary, but not sufficient for optimal metabolic health or optimal glucose control. You can't have perfect metabolic health or glucose control if your diet is, off the rails and tons of refined carbohydrates and sugars. But that's not going to just create, that's not the panacea. You also need to dial in these other factors about our health, our diet and our lifestyle that have a really strong impact on insulin sensitivity and glucose levels. And those things are really sleep, how much sleep we're getting, the quality of our sleep, stress. So how we're responding to stress, how much chronic low-grade stress that we're under, the acute stressors in our lives, and then physical activity for sure. That's a gigantic one. So those are kind of the three modifiable activities each day that we can really dial into to have optimal metabolic health. Stress is so interesting. And we do see it come up on continuous glucose monitoring to the extent that I've seen this in myself, the first time I gave a talk in front of people when I had my continuous glucose monitor on, I was fasting. So I hadn't eaten any carbohydrates or sugar. My glucose went up about 30 to 40 points during that talk in a little peak, just like a food induced peak, and then came down. So why is that happening if we're not consuming glucose? It's actually in evolutionarily adaptive response kind of gone awry. So when the body's under a source of threat or it thinks that it's in trouble, the body sends out hormonal signals, particularly cortisol and catecholamine hormones like adrenaline and things like that. And it sends those signals out into the body. There's a threat and we need to mobilize to get away from this threat. And so it tells the liver, which stores a little bit of glucose in it, to dump that glucose into the bloodstream to feed the muscles. So you can run from whatever you need to run from, to feed your brain so you can think sharp, all these things to kind of get you mobilized. Well, now a lot of our stressors, like giving a talk or responding to a stressful email or honking on the road, these things don't require us to activate our muscles and run away. They're just psychological stressors. They don't require that glucose dump. So now you've got this glucose dump into the bloodstream from stress, but you're not actually activating your muscles to use it. There's no sink for it. So it's just sitting there. And that's going to lead to then, needing to produce that insulin to get that into the cells. And so you're basically inducing this spike for no good reason. And so this is where thinking through things like stress management techniques and giving your body signals that you're safe and that you are not, under a time of stress, you're not needing to run from anything. You can actually positively impact that hormonal cascade to, prevent your body from having such a strong metabolic response. So for me, what's been fascinating, and I think for many of our members, is that aside from being food biofeedback, which in its own right is a huge step forward in terms of wearables and what we're able to get from, personal biodata, but also being a stress management biofeedback tool. Because when I see my glucose go up like that, I know I could have really done better in terms of managing my stress. I also noticed that on days when I'm just sort of chronically like a little bit extra stress, like something's going on with work or with personal life or whatever, my glucose often just kind of phase shifts up. So maybe I'm normally running, my baseline is around the 80s. And then after a meal, it'll go up to 95 or 100. I might see that it's just sort of always up at 90 that day. It's starting at 90 and going up to 120 after meals. And so it kind of just feels like it phase shifts it up. And I don't have any evidence to support that is, it hasn't been shown in the literature that chronic stress leads to kind of a baseline elevated glucose like that, but I've noticed it in myself. And the same is true with sleep deprivation. If I get for whatever reason, traveling or whatever, 5 hours of sleep or 6 hours of sleep, as opposed to my ideal 7.5 to 8, my glucose is just sort of phase shift up a few points. And I notice my spikes are larger. So, hormones are so complex, and stress and sleep deprivation both have a huge impact on that cascade of all these counter-regulatory metabolic hormones. And just sort of touching on the sleep piece, one night of sleep deprivation can cause people to be acutely insulin resistant the next day, meaning that their cells need more insulin to take up the same amount of glucose. So when and we're kind of all chronically sleep deprived, getting a little bit less than we need on average. And so the compounding effects of that over time are massive. So I think that exactly like you were saying, there are opportunities for continuous glucose monitoring to be more than just a nutrition biofeedback tool, but really a holistic lifestyle biofeedback tool. And that's what the Levels software does. That's what we bring together in the app, is help parse out which pieces of that equation are being affected by your choices and your day-to-day life, and then how to optimize those things.
Yeah, it's one of the things I think I love about what you've done the most, because when I was using just the Libre app before being introduced to you, the data, it's very difficult to parse out sort of what's happening. So one of the things I love about what Levels has done is make that very easy. And for those of you who get introduced to Levels, one of the things that you could do is that I love, you can literally take a picture of what you ate right before or right after, and then have your glucose excursion curve to look at based on that. So I love the way that is. And in terms of the stress thing, I've seen the same thing. And one of the things that I think is interesting about discussions with physicians is, for those of you listening to this, we're at this place now where we have this really interesting technology. We don't have a lot of the research to catch up. So a lot of us, and you can kind of hear this, and I love this, I can tell that you're sort of, the way that you approach this is a very open-minded, right? Same with me. We're just kind of like, hey, there's a lot that we know research-wise. There's a lot that we don't know. And for those of you listening, this is something that you've learned in the Next Level Human podcast a lot. As we get more clear in the science, you'll be able to hear more definitive sort of more nuanced answers from people like myself and Dr. Means in terms of what this means. But right now, we're sort of in this really interesting place where we're in data collection mode and making some sort of guesses. And so one of the things, I have seen the same thing that you've seen, actually. And I'll ask you to speculate, because I don't know that we have any in research on this, but maybe there is some research I'm not aware of. One of the things I've noticed with myself and with many patients who do intermittent fasting is some of these individuals will do intermittent fasting, and you'll see on the CGM that their blood sugar levels are improved, which would make sense, is what we would guess would happen, right? You go without food, if we're just looking at it from that end, and we go, well, you're not getting these glucose excursions, you don't need as much insulin, therefore insulin resistance is being improved. However, there's a whole other type of patient who, when they intermittent fast, they're getting, I believe, this stress response that Dr. Means is alluding to. And we're actually seeing their blood sugars potentially get worse. And we're also seeing hunger and cravings being triggered, right? So we all know that, ask yourself, everyone who's listening right now, if you fast all day or you fast for 16 hours, are you more or less likely to just have a salad and a chicken breast? Or are you craving pizza and burgers and chips and things like that? I have seen clinically that there is some indication that the blood sugar excursions and what happens through fasting, if you're getting this stress response, that you perhaps might want to eat a little bit sooner. And I want to see if you would agree with this or how you would think about this, because the way I see this, if this is a stress response, is there a way to preempt that stress response by giving the body what it's needing? A little bit of glucose, right? Instead of like saying, oh, I'm going to fast because I heard, Paleo Pauly tell me that, right? Like it's basically, we now have the ability to check this. So do you have anything to say about that? Can this tell us whether things like fasting would be good? And for people, are there some people getting this stress response from fasting? Are there other people who are not getting this stress response? What's your thoughts on that? And what have you seen clinically?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is one where I'd be so excited to see more research done in this. Same. Because it's like, we just don't know. I mean, there's been some small studies with fasting showing reversal of diabetes. Jason Fung has done some great research on this and many other groups, but really showing like the clinical power of longer fasts. But we don't really have that study that shows in a non-diabetic, sort of otherwise fairly healthy person, someone maybe who's in the high normal range, maybe has a little bit of extra weight, early insulin resistance, does a reasonable intermittent fasting protocol improve overall glycemic levels, improve weight, et cetera. Like that's what I'd like to see in a CGM study. It'd be fantastic. Because I know that for me personally, having used continuous glucose monitoring for 2 years, I see the impact of intermittent fasting on my glucose levels. And what's really neat about having a CGM on when you're fasting is that you have this biofeedback throughout the day showing you that what you're doing is having an impact. Like I've done a lot of 18-hour, 6-hour fast, 18-6, just sort of day to day. I've also done 3-day fasts before. And it's amazing. You see your glucose in the first day, kind of, up and down, a little bit of variability. Then after about, 4 to 6 hours, it starts trailing down, and then it starts trailing down some more. And by 24 hours, it's just at a low and flat level, and it's kind of not budging. And it's just a line for the next 2 days. And so it's this, and that if you eat, obviously it's going to go up. So it's this really kind of motivating tool during a fast to say, one, there is enough glucose in my bloodstream, because my body is actually, even though I'm not eating glucose during this fast, my body is making glucose. The body has all these ways of making glucose from other things in the body. Like, in the liver, it can make it convert from fat and amino acids into to glucose. And so that's amazing. A process called gluconeogenesis. Your body needs to keep the glucose in a stable range. Going too low is obviously it could be dangerous. And so to see that during a long-term fast and be comforted, like, yeah, I'm okay. Like my blood glucose is 75. It's not going too low. We're good. Even if you're hungry and kind of starting to get a little bit panicky, knowing that you're okay. On the flip side, your glucose might go quite low. And then you need to know, you might know like, okay, I don't feel good and my glucose is low. I actually probably need to end this fast a little bit earlier. So that's at least good feedback. And I think that it's also another thing that I've been experimenting with a little bit is using a ketone monitor. So to look for product of fat oxidation with my continuous glucose monitor during a fast. And it's so funny. I'm at my desk right now and I actually have like I've got all my monitors. I've got, two blood ketone monitors. I've got a breath ketone monitor. I've got another breath ketone monitor, Lumen. So I'm trying all of these different things. And what I love, so when glucose is low, this is sort of the physiology that I'm trying to capture with these devices. When glucose is low, your insulin is likely going to be low because you're not stimulating the insulin to be secreted because you're not eating carbohydrates during a fast. So glucose is low, can assume insulin's low. Well, insulin, one of its functions is to block fat burning. When insulin is high, it blocks fat burning. Glucose and fat are the two main ways we can make energy in the body. So when glucose is high and insulin is high, it tells the body, don't burn fat. We've got plenty of glucose around. When glucose is low and insulin is low, your body can start ramping up fat burning and moving through those fat stores for energy. That's what we want. That's metabolic flexibility. That's saying, okay, my body is becoming adapted to burn fat when there's low glucose. The average American is eating refined carbohydrates and sugar so much throughout the day. Breakfast, we're eating the cereal and then bread for lunch and then chips for, a snack and then potatoes at dinner. It's carbohydrates all day. Insulin is always high, which means you're rarely ever going to get into fat burning. And that's the beauty of a fast. You're intentionally keeping that glucose, exogenous glucose low and insulin low and being able to flip into metabolic flexibility to burn some fat. What's cool about tracking this with the CGM is that you can see your glucose going low, which is kind of a hunch. We can't check insulin right now at home, but it's a hunch that your insulin's probably low. Then you're checking your ketones and you're starting to see the increased fat burning and fat oxidation happening, which are ketones, as you get into the fast. So I'll sometimes start my fast at a ketone level of 0.8, which is kind of like, just starting ketone production. And by the time I finished my 18 hours, it's up at like 1.5, 1.6. That's incredibly motivating to me because it said, you actually did something here. You kept the glucose low and the readout of fat burning increase. So that's kind of a fun feedback cycle that I enjoy seeing as sort of an extra level of motivation that, this is not all for naught. You are getting into fat burning here.
I want to jump in real quick and tell you about one of my favorite new products. And to start out, I want to ask you a question. If you had to follow your friends around who are not the healthiest in the world and see what they are doing, what would be the number one thing you would probably tell them to do to start? For most people, that's going to be drinking more water, right? This is something that we talk about all the time in health and fitness. It's almost as if we think of it as an afterthought now because obviously water is so crucial. However, we oftentimes get this wrong. For example, did you know that when it comes to hydration, just drinking water can make things worse? Most people don't know this. Why? Partly because most people are over drinking water and under consuming the electrolytes that help water do its job. What we don't realize is that hydration is not just about water. It's about electrolytes, the minerals in there, as well as getting that water into the cells. And so you do not want to be over consuming water if you're not getting your electrolytes right. And this opens up a whole new discussion because most people are not getting their electrolytes right. For example, did you know that low sodium, too low sodium, is an issue? Just as much, if not more so, than high sodium. In other words, what we want if we're going to get the right electrolytes is to get the right amount of sodium and potassium and magnesium in the Goldilocks zone. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want it just right. This opens up a whole other thing here too, because people who are exercising, doing sauna therapies, doing low carb diets are disrupting and losing lots and lots of their electrolytes. For example, when insulin is not around in low carb diets, you will excrete lots of sodium. In other words, under that state, exercising, low carb diets, all these things, you actually need more sodium. And so if you're somebody who has been just drinking water, not paying attention to electrolytes, and also feeling fatigued, feeling like you're underperforming, not sleeping right, getting cramps, twitches, headaches, any of these things, then you are probably dealing with an electrolyte issue. This is where the product Element comes in. This product has been a game changer for me and many of my patients and clients. This is a rehydration electrolyte beverage, basically. It is a powder of electrolytes formulated with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium without the added sugar and other nonsense that comes in beverages like Gatorade. This stuff is basically a rehydration beverage on steroids. It is the thing that is going to replenish your electrolytes in the right ratios, decrease fatigue, really correct chronic dehydration. And by the way, many people are dehydrating themselves, becoming hyponatremic, low sodium, when they're consuming too much water. You need your electrolytes on board, especially if you are someone who is losing lots of sodium and other electrolytes through low carb diets and lots of exercise. This is where Element comes in. Element is a new sponsor to the Next Level Human podcast. I cannot recommend this product enough. I have been using this stuff for months now, and I have immediately seen changes in my energy levels. I feel like I'm operating on a whole other level, and I have seen this as being the primary thing that people who have been using Element have been telling me, that their fatigue is getting better, especially fatigue that comes after very intense workouts that involve lots of sweating and lots of intense output from the nervous system. Please check out Element. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. DrinkElement.com. That's DrinkElement.com. DrinkElement.com, and let's get back to the show. Sorry to break in. I want to cover one of my sponsors, Organifi. Now, look, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, and many of you who know me well know this, but shockingly, I cannot stand vegetables. I really do not like vegetables. I have not liked them since a child. I think it has something to do with my mom, who cooked everything just boiled everything, no salt, no fat, no taste, period. And so I developed an extreme dislike for almost all vegetables. And still to this day, I have a difficult time getting in my fruits and vegetables. Well, Organifi, started by my good friend Drew Canoli, who I've developed a relationship over the years, and I am really sort of tickled that we finally get to do this together with Organifi sponsoring the Next Level Human podcast. Drew is a Next Level Human. Organifi is a Next Level Human company. I can't say enough about them. I'm excited for them to be on board as a sponsor for the Next Level Human podcast. My favorite products, let me tell you about them. They have a ton, but I use 3 pretty much every day. I use Organifi Gold before I go to sleep. This is their turmeric tea based on sort of the old Ayurvedic golden milk. It is absolutely fantastic. It contains lots of different relaxing herbs, turmeric, tastes wonderful. And one of the things this has done for me is I had a very bad wine habit at night. It started out as just 1 glass of wine. Lately, it's turned into 2, 3, and sometimes a bottle. What I've done starting in 2021 is use Organifi. This is what I have in lieu of wine. And I sit there just like I used to sit with my wine, and I have the Organifi Gold. I also use the green and red juice powders. I have never liked greens and reds juices, period. These powders to me always tasted like swamp water. I use 1 scoop of the greens, 1 scoop of the reds first thing in the morning before my coffee. It has become a ritual over the last several years. It is fantastic. Those are the ones I use the most. Of course, they have a great line of protein products, and they have a new Organifi Gold chocolate, which I have not tried yet, but I cannot wait to try that because you all know I love cocoa powder and use it for lots of different things, for cravings and everything else. Check out Organifi, Organifi.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. Please take care of Organifi the same way they're taking care of the earth, doing amazing things as a company, and now taking care of the Next Level Human podcast so we can all be together and have these discussions. Organifi.com, use the code NEXTLEVEL. Let's get back to the show. Here we go. And for those of you who have experienced this, just a point of clarification, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Dr. Means, but one of the things that happens, if you're one of these people who are noticing when you first start a fast that your blood sugars are jumping all over the place, realize that, remember, Dr. Means was talking about the breakdown of glycogen. Well, that's going to take about 24 to 48 hours before that goes away. And so you may actually see blood sugar spiking a little bit from these stress hormones. So you need to give that time. So oftentimes in my clinical practice, I say, yes, you may see that if you're sort of this stress type person in the beginning, while your glycogen has some of this storage, glucose there. But as that glycogen sort of drains, you'll begin seeing that curve come down. At the same time, a lot of people will say, well, I'm a little bit worried about my blood sugars going too low. And typically, this is why I also like to measure ketones, because as your blood sugars go low, we're not so concerned about your blood sugars being super low, so long as the ketones are coming up sort of with it, not going up to huge amounts that would be like, near 10 in someone who's diabetic, but in that 1 to 3 sort of zone. And you oftentimes will see that. So I love this sort of idea. And just so people understand the mechanism, when you break down your fat, you're getting glycerol. The glycerol backbone is used in gluconeogenesis, as are the amino acids as well. And so you're sort of fixing this whole issue, and you can watch this biochemistry in real time if you understand this. And so it's an amazing sort of way to look at it. And I do think, it is motivating for people who are thinking, oh, well, fasting doesn't necessarily work for me. Well, maybe for you, you have to wait a little bit, and it's going to take a little bit longer. And so it is sort of this, finally, we have a window into what we're feeling to sort of understand this biochemistry. So am I getting the biochemistry right there? Do you have anything to correct me on there and anything to add?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the stress piece is important because, like you said, fasting can be a stressor. Like we're taking away our fundamental thing that, we're striving for every day, which is food for survival. You take that away, it can be a stress signal. But and that can lead, like you said, to potentially some erratic glucose in the beginning because, we've got the cortisol, we're doing that liver glycogen release, et cetera. And I think over time, it does typically stabilize. Depending on the person, the glucose might stabilize in a fast after 4 hours. Maybe it takes a day. But it's a really good point to note. It's also a bigger macro point about this is a hormetic stressor in the body. You're causing stress. If you are in a place, and this gets at when you should do a fast. Fasting is probably not what everyone should be doing every single day. We have a certain capacity for handling all sorts of stressors each day. And when you go over that, when you exceed that sort of limit of what your capacity is, you're going to have it's going to cause problems for the body. That's when you're going to start leaning into dysfunction. We want to stress the body enough that it's like a good challenge, but not, and that we then learn to adapt. The body can adapt, but we don't want to do it so much that we're actually causing dysfunction in the body. So if you're not getting a lot of sleep and you're exercising a ton and there's a lot of life stressors going on with work and family or whatever, that might not be the time to do an extended fast, to just dump one more stressor on your body. Or for a woman, if you're in a certain part of your cycle that's particularly taxing on you and you're training for something athletically, and stuff is busy with school, that might not be the time to throw another stressor on your body. So that is something worth thinking about. I tend to do fasting when things are pretty smooth and stable in my life, and I know my body can handle that extra bit of stress. And another thing to note is that I think fasting becomes less stressful over time because your body does adapt. if you're doing your first 24-hour fast and you've been eating carbohydrates for most meals, you're kind of a glucose dominant processor, you have not given your body a lot of time to burn fat. Those pathways of fat burning and fat oxidation might be a little rusty, or if you're starting in a place where you're a little bit insulin resistant, and your insulin levels are kind of always a little bit higher. And so you just have really been putting the brake on fat burning. Let's say you launch into a 24-hour fast. Your body's going to be like, what the heck? Like, I'm not making fat efficiently. So you start running out of your stored glucose, your glycogen, and you're working through some of your circulating glucose, but your body's not quite ready to ramp up into fat burning because you just haven't done it that much. You're going to feel like crap. Like you're going to be hungry and moody, and it's going to be stressful. Now, let's say you ease into it. First you start by just eating a little bit of a lower glycemic diet. You learn how to keep your glucose more flat and stable with food throughout the day. Let's say you do that for a month or two, kind of maybe bringing your insulin levels down over time. Then you start doing a 12-hour fast. So you stop eating after dinner, and then let's say you stop eating at 8 p.m. and you start eating at 8 a.m. That might be more than you've ever gone before, because maybe in the past you've been snacking at midnight and then eating at 7 a.m. and just a 7-hour fast overnight. So start easing into something. Give the body a little bit more practice with like burning through glycogen, moving into fat burning, then ease into the 16-hour fast. Then maybe only after weeks or months are you ready to do sort of this longer fast. And that's not the case. This is not the case for everyone. I'm just saying that there are adaptations that the body has to make over time to use these pathways in the body, these cellular signaling pathways, these fat oxidation pathways. And it can sometimes really be stressful when you just sort of are right at the beginning and jumping in. So ease into it and think about the body as adapting over time. So I do think that fasting can become a little bit less stressful. And I know for me, this is one thing I've learned about me with fasting is that it is much more stressful for me if I fast in the evening for a longer period of time versus the morning. So I stay up late. That's what I do. I usually go to bed around midnight. And so if I stop eating at 6 and have 6 hours before I go to sleep where I'm not eating, that feels like a big stress signal on my body. However, if I stop eating at 8:30 or 9 and then fast in the morning for longer till maybe 1 or 2 p.m., same duration of fast, but I've just shifted it towards more in the morning versus at night, much easier for my body. Doesn't feel stressful. Don't get hungry. I avoided that for a long time because there is evidence to suggest that it's sort of better for the body to stop eating earlier in the evening. Eating late at night can interfere with sleep, and we're a little bit more insulin resistant naturally at night. So eating late at night may have sort of a little bit more of a heavy impact on glucose levels than if you eat earlier in the day. And so always thought it's better to fast in the evening more than in the morning, but it doesn't work for me. It's stressful. And I have noticed with checking my ketones and all this stuff, I still get the same benefit of ketone production and all this stuff if I fast more in the morning. So it's really personalized and individual. And that was a big breakthrough for me to learn that I'm going to be a morning faster, not an evening faster. And I've been able to be much more successful. So it's really just listening to your body, and figuring out what works for you.
Yeah, I love your brain and your clinical approach. I often tell people there's only one rule in nutrition, and that is do what works for you. And something like levels helps you figure out what works for you. I actually, same thing for me. Aware of the research showing, maybe it's better to, cut off dinner early and fast through the night. I simply can't do that, but I don't have much of an appetite in the morning, so I can go longer. Now, I don't want the people who are not as savvy to think that we're, saying everyone should fast. It's just part of the discussion. It's in fact, and I'll just kind of give my clinical approach, and you can comment on it if you want. But I think we're in alignment here. Typically, my approach for people who I'm trying to make more metabolically flexible is I pretty much start with a 12-hour fast and then small, frequent meals within that 12 hours. Now, that is a very old concept that people go, oh, well, why are you doing small, frequent meals? Well, for someone who is not able to manage their blood sugar, first of all, I want them to see how food's impacting their blood sugar. I also want them to avoid hunger and cravings. And then slowly but surely, I began to say, okay, what do you think about perhaps now cutting out the snacks and just going breakfast, lunch, and dinner? then, oh, what do you think about perhaps having a smaller breakfast or a smaller dinner? And so it's a stepwise process. And it sounds like you're using something similar here versus someone who's very athletic, more metabolically flexible. Perhaps they can launch right into a fast. But for most people who are the average American who are eating big, huge meals filled with junk food, I'm typically like, let's just get you equal time during the day, eating and not eating, and let's control hunger and cravings by having small, frequent meals, and then slowly taking those away as we see that glucose curve begin to sort of figure itself out. And what you'll oftentimes see is the peaks get less high. You'll see more peaks and less plateaus in the glucose sort of curves. And this to me means improving their insulin resistance and being able to make their metabolism more flexible. And I love the way you say that, because in a sense, we do have different pathways. I mean, everything is running down to acetyl-CoA in a sense, but if you're not running that fat burning pathway, it does build up cobwebs, so to speak, so you sort of have this sort of issue that if you're only eating glucose all of the time, you're running that pathway pretty nicely, but you're not burning fat. And so this begins the process. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but the next couple of things before we sort of wrap up is I do want to know a little bit about how this is working, and let's talk about some edge cases. But anything that you finally have to say about, sort of the process by which you would begin managing blood sugar for somebody who's never done this before versus like the biohacking community who's very much into this.
Yeah. I mean, for everyone, it's so personalized, and the best thing to do is to work, I think, with a great, physician who's thinking in an integrative systems biology way. So whether that's, a regular MD who's really, really thinking holistically and deeply about metabolic health, or someone with a naturopathic physician or functional medicine or whatever it is, like someone who's really thinking deeply about these things. And if you're really struggling with metabolism, there are a lot of these doctors out there like yourself, like myself, who are thinking about that whole picture. And that sometimes is what's helpful as a guide to kind of break through, big breakthrough if we're feeling stalled in our progress. But I think for the person who's, like the person who's just getting started and is really just, trying to dip their toe in, I think everything you said is totally right. Really start incrementally. Maybe even that 12-hour fast is really hard in the beginning. I know that for me, sometimes 12 hours can feel like a really, really long time. So like you said, just starting by getting those glucose elevations down, like trying to just start by avoiding the big spikes, that can do wonders for the body. And like you said, there are no rules for nutrition. There's no one size fits all. But I will say one thing that can be a huge step forward is just getting rid of the refined sugars and getting rid of the ultra refined and ultra processed grains. Those two things as just basic starting points can, I think, have a really big impact on reducing that glycemic variability, those ups and down swings throughout the day. So just starting to read the packages, minimize the refined sugar. There's about 60 names for sugar. So learn what they are. Google, what are the names for sugar, and try and avoid those. And try and figure out swaps for the ultra refined grain foods, which is literally everything. It's bread, tortillas, chips, pasta, etc. Now there's alternatives for everything. There's black bean pasta. There's, zucchini noodles for pasta. For bread, we've got coconut flour bread, which is much lower carb. You can use butter lettuce for your taco shells. You can use chard or collard greens for your burrito wraps. Like there's so many things that you can do to eat the same foods that you love that are not having all these refined carbohydrates. And we have tons and tons of information about swaps like that on the Levels blog. Because I do think, I know for me, you don't want to feel like you're just depriving yourself of everything you love, but easy, simple swaps can sometimes do wonders in getting that glucose spike down. For me, mashed potatoes or any type of potato product sends my glucose up like 80 points, which I never want to do. I never want my glucose to spike 80 points after a meal. But when I switch to cauliflower mashed potatoes, which I can now make to taste exactly like regular potatoes, I have zero spike. So I'm eating the same thing. It looks the same. It tastes the same. And it's an 80-point glucose difference. If you can start to do that for lots of different things that are causing you spikes, you're going to be well on your way towards, moving towards more optimal metabolic health and metabolic flexibility. So So that's all I'd say on that. But yeah, I think your
Yeah.
approach is spot on.
That's a great discussion. So why don't we talk just a little bit about helping people sort of manage this? What would you say we should be looking at in terms of our glucose spikes? So how high should these things be going? Is there a number we should be trying to keep it below? What would be optimal there when we're looking at this on a CGM?
Yeah. So first, I'll just say what is like the standard guidelines. So right now, all we have to go off of is really the American Diabetes Association ranges for what's normal, what's pre-diabetic, what's diabetic, and the International Diabetes Federation, IDF, their guidelines. What they say is if your fasting glucose, so your morning glucose right when you wake up is under 100 milligrams per deciliter, you're considered normal. If it's between 100 and 125, you're considered pre-diabetic. And if you're above 126 or above, you're considered to have type 2 diabetes. Then we look at post-meal levels. So after you eat, where does your glucose go to? And based on there's actually not a guideline for this for non-diabetic individuals. All we know is that this, what's called an oral glucose tolerance test, which is where you drink a 75-gram glucose drink. And then if your glucose is under 140 milligrams per deciliter after 2 hours after that drink, based on American Diabetes Association criteria, that's considered to be non-diabetic. That's not very helpful. It doesn't tell us like, okay, well, what should we shoot for after a meal for optimal health? The International Diabetes Federation does have a take on this, which is that your glucose should never go above 140 milligrams per deciliter after a standard meal. Like you should stay below that at all times. So that's great. That's all helpful for clinical stuff. But what about what's optimal? What do we want to shoot for? So that's where I'm getting into more personal opinion and my interpretation of the literature. So let's talk about fasting glucose first. That's first morning glucose when you haven't eaten or drank any calories for 8 hours. If you look at the research, so first of all, lower is not always better. We want to stay within sort of a healthy range. We need glucose in our bloodstream. So let's say 70 is about the lower limit of kind of where we want to be for our blood glucose. And 100, above 100 is considered pre-diabetic for fasting glucose. So we're in that 70 to 100 range. So based on standard clinical criteria, we'd say, oh, well, everything between 70 and 100 is probably the same because it's all normal. Not true. If you look at the research, as fasting glucose increases over time from the 70s up to 100, we increase our rates of stroke, of heart disease, of diabetes, of obesity. You want to stay in that low normal range of fasting glucose, not that high range. So if your glucose is 99 milligrams per deciliter fasting, very different than someone whose fasting glucose is 75 milligrams per deciliter. So I usually say between 72 and 85 milligrams per deciliter is an optimal fasting glucose based on what I've sort of looked at in the literature. Then looking at post-meal spikes, this one's even harder. Like we have really no guidelines on this. If you look at studies of large non-diabetic populations wearing continuous glucose monitors, just free living, what we find is that actually most people spend the vast majority of their time between 70 and 120. So I would say for people listening, if you're keeping your glucose below about 120 after meals, ideally I try and be below 110. I think that's starting to get into a better range. So putting that all together, probably sticking between 70 and 120 for the vast majority of your day is good. I tend to try and stay between like 70 and 110, 70 and 100, just kind of keep it pretty tight. And that works well for me. So how about you? I'm curious what your ranges are.
Well, personally for me, people who listen to the podcast know I tend to run in pre-diabetic ranges. It's interesting that I do this work and I struggle pretty mightily to control sort of my blood sugars. I'm sort of this stress reactive type, so my blood sugars will go up pretty high. But I would agree with you in my clinical experience with other individuals. I usually look at 120, 140. I'm like, if you're starting to get up in that 140 range, I'm a little bit worried about you. If it's peaking up there after meals, I prefer it to be under 120. And honestly, like ideally, the less the spike, the better, as far as I'm concerned, right? What we really want is the body to be able to clear that glucose sort of really quickly. And so I think I'm right on board with you there. And, and this brings up other things too, that you'll see. Certainly when I am working out, my blood sugars will go up really high, really fast. And I oftentimes see if I'm sleep deprived and things like that, they'll go up more. So I also notice that, I'm wanting that to be relatively similar to meals, although I will oftentimes see in the workouts that I do, CrossFit, I'll see it go up much higher than my meals. And so I've seen that in athletic populations that these blood sugars can spike pretty high, which makes me sort of just like, I wonder what that's about. And we'll sort of figure out what that's about. And I don't know if you've seen that either. So partly when you get the stress effect, when you're out there running away from the lion, let's say, working out, you'll see these things spike a little bit more. And that's something that I don't think we have much research on at all. I haven't really seen any, but I've certainly seen clinically that that's happening. And because these people are so fit and so healthy and so productive, and they clear that glucose pretty quickly, I'm not concerned about that. One of the things I also will say about working out is a nice walk after one of those workouts clears that glucose even faster. And one of the things that I've seen clinically that is really, really useful for people who are having sort of high blood sugars, we have to remember, right? The muscle is, an independent glucose sink, independent of, insulin yeah. When it moves, it actually puts those GLUT receptors out there in the same way insulin does. And so movement is a big piece of this as well. But I would agree with you. I would say we want to limit those glucose excursions as much as possible. And certainly 120 and 140 are sort of the numbers that I'm looking at. 140, I start to get worried. 120, I'm thinking that's optimal. And really, the people who are really healthy and eating very healthy diets and low carb diets, they're not getting, they're sometimes staying right below 110, and 100 sometimes. And so, and by the way, from my perspective, for those of you listening, I think that really is, I'm right there with you, Dr. Means. I really think that's where we should be getting to. And it does take time. There are some edge cases like myself and other people that I've worked with that are difficult to sort of figure out what's going on. I suspect mine is sleep apnea. So I get these, I have sleep apnea, I snore, and I'll oftentimes see my blood sugar spike in the middle of the night. And actually, that's a question I have for you clinically. One of the things you'll oftentimes see on these CGMs is glucose spiking in the middle of the night. And people are oftentimes sort of concerned about that. Do you have any sort of indication of what's going on there with individuals? I see it happen a lot with people who have apnea. Obviously, if you're not getting oxygen, this is going to create a stress response and you're going to get this adrenaline surge. It may even wake you up, but you'll see glucose rise. So those are all my thoughts on that. But I mean, I'm wondering, I know I've seen it quite a bit with looking at CGMs, and it's really neat, right? It's the first time we've ever been able to see what's happening with us in the middle of the night. And so any thoughts about that you have would be useful for us.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that goes on at night with glucose. And I think a couple things to note is, one, if glucose is kind of all over the place in the beginning of the night, kind of up and down, up and down, up and down, it's definitely worth looking at your last meal of the day. And what did that kind of cause a big spike that then is leading to you spiking and crashing and then kind of bouncing around. Sometimes high carbohydrate meals later in the evening, or eating dessert, or a drink with sugar in it or something after the dinner, can lead to this sort of jumping around overnight, which is not going to be great for sleep quality. So I tend to kind of move towards more keto-esque meals as the day goes on, because I don't want to have those carbohydrates late in the night that are going to send me bouncing around. That's one thing with sleep and food. Another is that our sleep cycle actually has an impact on our glucose levels. So in REM sleep, our glucose tends to drop a little bit. So that can kind of make it look like it's going down and then up again. There's also just a phenomenon called pressure-induced sensor error, which is where if you lay on your sensor, so I've got my sensor on the back of my arm here, if you lay on it, it can cause a sharp drop and then it'll look like it's kind of springing back. So those are some things to kind of keep in mind about nighttime readings. And then sleep apnea, I think that certainly could be an important component of why people might be spiking at night. If you are, having an apneic episode where you stop breathing, you're occluding your airway, and then you're gasping for breath, that's going to lead to your heart rate going up. It's going to lead to that stress response. And definitely a plug for anyone listening. If you're, a snorer, or if you've ever been told that you've had sort of that gasping at night, like definitely get checked out for sleep apnea. It is just something that's easily, in many cases, easily treatable, and something that will really have wide-ranging of positive effects on health. So as a former ear, nose, and throat surgeon, I'm just care a lot about sleep apnea because getting interrupted sleep is just going to have far-reaching effects on health. And on the flip side, a quality night's sleep can just be like an amazing medicine for so many different things.
Yeah, one other thing we didn't mention actually is alcohol. For those of you who drink at night, this will suppress glycogenolysis. And so, so the breakdown of glycogen. And so you may see the brakes come off this sort of in the middle of the night too. So alcohol could be playing sort of a role here as well. So I want to be respectful of your time, but let's talk about a couple edge cases here that maybe you have some insight on and maybe you don't. But one of the things that I oftentimes see, and I work with a lot of athletes and a lot of biohackers, and so a lot of them are doing cold plunges and sauna therapies and stuff like that, and you will see large blood sugar sort of excursions with sauna therapy in particular, similar to what you will see with workouts. And, obviously this is a thermal stress. It's sort of, again, a hormetic response. We sort of use these things, but have you seen this as well? And should we be concerned about that kind of thing? Sauna therapies, cold plunges, are they going to have an impact on this? And are you concerned about it? And have you seen it clinically?
I've definitely seen a lot of spikes with people going into a cold plunge bath or with a really hot shower. And I think there's two pieces going on here. I think one is the body's stress response, like you said, causing that same thing that we see with high intensity interval training exercise, with stressful psychological events, with this, like cold is a stressor. And so you might see glucose go up just because of that. There also may be impacts on the sensor as well. And just how it's reading. So something that I really like to do is to check a finger prick glucose when it's in a acute shift like that, to just verify, like, is this actually happening in my blood, or is this something that's going on with the sensor? And so when I've done that or had other, members at levels do that, it kind of varies, like the extent to which it's actually capturing a real spike versus maybe artifact from the sensor and the temperature.
I do the same, actually.
Yeah.
I definitely do the same. And actually, another edge case, this will be funny. You're probably like, Jade, you're crazy. But so I have some friends who will put sensors on both arms and
yes.
try to sort of correlate. And you'll see a pretty big difference sometimes between those. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, because they just go, is this thing even accurate? Like, I'm getting a 20-point difference from my right arm to my left arm. And so is there anything tips you can give us there? Why might that be happening?
Yeah. So every lab test, every wearable is going to have some degree of inaccuracy. That is just the reality of any test and any wearable. And continuous glucose monitoring is about 9% in terms of variation between what's in the blood and what's on the CGM, what's the CGM is reading, continuous glucose monitor.
Because it's not really measuring blood, right? It's measuring the interstitial space, which correlates, right?
That's right. Yeah. So glucose basically seeps out of the blood vessels into the space around the blood vessels, the space around the cells, which is called the interstitial fluid, interstitial space. That's where the glucose monitor is actually picking up. And so there can be about a 5 to 15 minute delay between what's in the blood and what's in the interstitial space, but they tend to be very closely correlated. Based on the studies that the manufacturers have done of these CGMs, so Dexcom and Abbott, it's around, a 9 to 10% difference. And that's pretty standard across most wearables. So it's not like it's, compared to your Apple Watch or Whoop or whatever, measuring your heart rate. That's pretty typical. And, these are devices that are being used for diabetes management, as well as for wellness purposes, like what Levels is using this for. And so these are FDA approved to be considered accurate enough to treat, clinical conditions. And so the question of, these differences, maybe someone wearing it and has a 20-point difference between the two arms, certainly have seen that. And one thing that I think is important to remember is that the delta between sort of before a meal and after a meal, that's what I care most about. I do care about baseline levels as well, but I'm really care most about the dynamic changes. And that's something that's usually going to be pretty standard between, your different sensors. But you may notice a little bit of a different baseline between the different sensors that you wear. And for people listening, you wear these sensors for 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on the brand. And so like this sensor, I'm going to have on my arm for 2 weeks, and then I'll take it off and put a new one on. And it's possible the next one I put on, my baseline looks a little bit different, like 4 or 5 or 10 points different. The nice thing about the brand, the Dexcom CGM, which is one of the manufacturers, is you can actually calibrate. So I can do a finger prick of my glucose, and let's say it's 10 points different from my sensor. I can put that into my phone, what my actual blood glucose is, and it will actually calibrate. So, but the big picture point is that those deltas between before and after meals and the overall 24-hour trends, that's what I care about more than just the concrete value of like, am I 90 or am I a 93, at baseline? So
such an important point. And by the way, those of you who are listening, it's the same thing when you're looking at bioelectrical impedance machines for fat loss and stuff like that. Those things it's not the accuracy of the actual measure. It's just the change between the two. A final question for me, because I know a lot of people do IV therapies and things like that. So vitamin C, you can see some pretty huge peaks. What can you tell us a little bit about that? Why is that happening with people getting these huge blood sugar responses after going through vitamin C therapies and things like that, IV therapy?
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure the mechanism of this is that it's causing a sensor error here.
That's my understanding too.
Yeah. So if you're getting an IV vitamin C infusion or something like that, like you may see a totally erroneous value there. So I would say, don't take that one.
Those two compounds look very similar. So, a lot of people say, maybe it's thinking it's glucose, but yes, I mean, I've seen people go up to 400, 500, and I'm just
wow.
That's just the vitamin. That's just the vitamin C, sort of in it.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I always want to say, this is the Next Level Human podcast. And one of the things I know as an entrepreneur is that it is incredibly difficult. People don't really know what it takes to do something like what you have done. It is a gift to the world. I don't think people really understand what the risk you take and all the things you do to bring something like this to market. So we are indebted to you. I am so grateful for your work. This is it's just so important, Dr. Means. And I just think you're just a wonderful human for doing this and bringing this to all of us. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to leave us with and make sure that we sort of understand before I let you kind of get back to your day?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And yeah, I've got an amazing team, 5 co-founders who I did this with. So we've got a huge team of people, and definitely, it's amazing starting a company and leaving surgery to do this. And so grateful for the group of amazing people I have around me helping get this off the ground. But I think the thing that I would just conclude with is that the beautiful thing about the human body is it's so adaptable, and the metabolic health, it is really the core foundation of our total health. It's the core pathway of how we make energy for every one of the 37 trillion cells in the body. And, our modern life, our modern diet and lifestyles, industrialized, high stress, low sleep, low physical activity, it's hijacking this core fundamental system of our body that makes energy. And that lack of being able to efficiently produce energy in the body is causing the dysfunction that we're seeing showing up as all the chronic diseases we're dealing with today. We've got to get metabolic health on track for real, true fundamental health. But the beauty is that even if we're down the sort of spectrum of kind of going off course with our metabolism or metabolic health, we can turn the tide. We can go in the other direction. The body is so adaptable. And when you give the body the right conditions, the right sort of environment, and you create that environment through food, through how you're responding to stress, through how you're sleeping, through how you're moving, through how you're supporting your microbiome, through the micronutrients you're putting in your body, through avoidance of toxins. That's the environment you're creating. When you give it what it wants and what it thrives in, it will turn in the right direction. It will adapt and get back on track. It's not a one-way street. So just a very, it's hopeful. Like we always have room to kind of turn things around and go in the right direction. And we can take really simple steps to do that. And so I'm really grateful for you and your podcast, giving people those tools and that information and synthesizing it so that people can do that. And really grateful to to have had this chat. Thank you so much.
Same with me. Dr. Casey Means, thanks so much for your brain. Thanks for your amazing work. We appreciate you so much. And we will talk to you soon. Have a great day.
You too.